Would you be in favor of higher gas taxes?
I'm not necessarily saying a higher gas tax.
Oh, see, I am. I would love to see that. I'm just seeing if you're on board.
And here's why I don't think we need higher gas taxes, because I think the price of gasoline itself is going to ration demand. But here's what I would be against. I would be against cutting gasoline taxes when oil prices go up, because that sends you the wrong signal. When gasoline prices go up, what that means is gasoline is becoming scarcer and we should consume less. But if we cut our excise taxes, we override that market signal so that we end up consuming more gasoline when really market prices are telling us to consume less.
Don't you think and let's just talk about transportation, it seems to me that one of the fundamental issues and the fundamental problems from a public policy point of view is that we really want to have our cake and eat it too. By the way, I couldn't agree with you more about what we should have done. We should not have bailed out the car companies. We should have built 10 subway stops. It would have made all the sense in the world. Okay, that's water to the bridge. But isn't the issue right now that we're trying to do both, and because of that we're doing neither?
I think that is. And you know, I went to Copenhagen on a speech and observed a few things, what makes that country green. And, you know, you may be surprised to what makes that country green. What makes that country green is energy prices, not windmills. Copenhagen and Denmark would have you believe, you know, would highlight the fact that they are a world-leading 20% of their power comes from wind turbines. What they don't highlight is that the other 80% comes from coal. And that's roughly the same percentage that coal would have in China's grid. So the most obvious immediate question is, how has Denmark been able to reduce its emissions? It's one of the very few countries that actually did live up to its Kyoto commitments. While at the same time, China's emissions, with its 80% coal in electricity, has gone through the roof. And the answer is, it has nothing to do with the source of power. It has everything to do with the price of power. That in Denmark, you pay roughly about 30 cents per kilowatt hour for power, whether it comes from coal or wind. That's about 3 to 4 times what the average Canadian would pay. Lo and behold, people in Denmark consume 30% less power. And if you go to Copenhagen, you don't see a lot of, you know, desolate, depressed people, shuddering in the side because they don't have any power. I mean, all the surveys show that the Danes are some of the happiest people in the world. And I think there's a big message there that we can reduce our energy consumption a lot more than we ever believe. Japan's a country that got 30% of its power from nuclear power a year ago, and they've already shut down 52 out of the 54 nuclear reactors. Well, once again, we're finding that people can adapt to higher prices. People can end up significantly reducing their energy consumption without the dire consequences of, going back into the Stone Age. And that's a lesson I think most North Americans have yet to learn, but that's a lesson that triple-digit energy prices, I think, will teach us.
But couldn't then that vision, Bill, be consistent with stronger economic growth? I mean, just think about someone's household. Is all of a sudden, if you're telling me, if I'm using 20% less energy, and I'm essentially enjoying the same quality of living and standard of life, and even if it's more expensive, but I'm actually spending fewer dollars, I got more stuff to do other things with. Because what you're giving is a profoundly positive, upbeat message here about the possibilities, it seems to me.
The way in which we're going to be able to manage our economies facing energy scarcity in the here and now is on the demand side. Okay, like instead of turning cow dung into high-octane fuel, what we've got to do is drive less. And I'm not saying, in the fullness of time, we may well develop alternatives to hydrocarbon power. But right now, we've got to learn to use less energy, and you're absolutely right. Those economies that can reduce their energy consumption are going to be far more resilient in the face of today's oil prices than those economies that cannot reduce their energy consumption. And I would point to Denmark and Japan as two examples. Now, in fairness, necessity is the mother of invention. It's easy for Denmark, or it's a lot easier for Denmark, to charge 30 cents per kilowatt hour and to slap 180% surcharge on a car with a V8 engine when you don't have a huge coal industry and a huge auto industry in your own economy. Because when Denmark slaps 180% surcharge on a car with a V8 engine, it's some auto worker in Germany who's getting laid off and not in Denmark. And, you know, so it's a little bit more challenging for a place like Ontario, which assembles more cars than any other province or state in North America, or a place like Alberta that has a huge coal reserves, to adopt those measures. But nevertheless, adopting these measures is what we ultimately have to do.
And I think to me, what the key takeaway, what I'm sort of getting, which is, well, I love this because I think this is actually far even more optimistic than, not that you're a pessimistic guy in the book, but it's even more optimistic than the message, is it seems to me that you're allowing that we can reconcile high oil prices and still positive economic growth if we do it the right way.
If we are able to reduce our energy usage in the economy. But I would argue that there may be even a more positive message for the book, because I think what we're going to find is even our seemingly inexorable drive to environmental self-destruction is going to run out of fuel. That we're never going to emit half the carbon that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is forecasting that we're going to emit in the next 20 to 30 years, if our economies are no longer growing at this pace. Because the first thing you'll find when our economies stop growing is they stop emitting. Take the US economy, for example. Emissions actually fell in that economy in 2009, even though the Waxman-Markey climate change bill died on the Senate floor. Emissions didn't fall because of anything Obama or Congress did. Emissions fell because the US economy stopped growing. And when the US economy stopped growing, they started burning less coal and oil. And when you burn less coal and oil, lo and behold, you emit less. Take another example, the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia's emissions fell by a staggering 30%. And Moscow wasn't even targeting carbon emissions. So, you know, I'll put my money on the economy over anything that Stephen Harper or Barack Obama or any of those leaders pledge at the Cancun or Copenhagen summits, because ultimately it's the economy that controls emissions. And I'm saying that if you were to look inside the bowels of those models that the climate change scientists are using, for example, forecasting that China, that already burns 3.2 trillion tons of coal, is going to double its coal consumption over the next 20 years. My question to them is, yeah, where do you think China's going to be getting that coal? And what do you think China's going to be paying for that coal? Because coal's already over $115 a ton. Again, not because the world will ever run out of coal in an absolute sense, but the world doesn't have the cheap, affordable coal that's going to allow China and India to double its consumption for 20 years. So, for those of us who are concerned about the sustainability of our world economy, for those of us who are concerned about the sustainability of our planet, triple-digit oil prices may be the silver bullet that we've all been looking for.
You commented earlier about, in your remarks, about sort of the ineffectiveness of monetary policy and fiscal policy in the face of high oil. Could you just comment, if you were at the Bank of Canada, what would you be doing with interest rates right now if you were responsible for looking at budget deficits, balancing, or coming the middle line? What would you be recommending right now?
Well, here's my problem with what Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of Canada, has been telling Canadians. He's been telling Canadians they're carrying way, way too much debt. And he's been telling Canadians that they got to cut back on their borrowing. He's telling Canadians, don't go out and get that mortgage to buy that new condo. But at the same time, he's setting interest rates at a level that can only have one effect, which is to induce Canadians to do precisely what he's telling them not to. It's akin to saying, you're overweight, you need to go on a diet, and then serve you a 12-course meal. So, you know, if I'm a condo developer, what am I going to listen to? What Mark Carney says or what Mark Carney does? Many of you are probably wondering, is there a housing bubble out there? Some of you may remember that about 20 years ago, I called a housing market crash in 1989 and a 25%.
So it was your fault. I was developing property then. I almost went bankrupt.
Well, let me just compare the two events. It wasn't that housing prices were more overvalued in 1989 than they are in 2012. The difference is, to get a housing market crash, it's not just a bubble. You need to prick that bubble. Back in 1989, we had a central banker at the Bank of Canada who not only talked the talk, but walked the walk. He pushed interest rates up to 9–10%, and all of a sudden, the housing market collapsed. For his troubles, he was fired by the finance minister of the day, Paul Martin, if any of you recall. I see a big difference in the behavior of that central bank governor and the central bank governor we have today. And just because housing prices are overvalued or condo prices are overvalued in 2012 doesn't mean there's going to be a crash unless you prick the bubble. Now, if Mark Carney actually followed through on what he was saying and started raising interest rates to levels that discouraged you from acquiring more debt, yes, then we would have a housing market crash. And maybe we still will. But the fact that housing prices are overvalued is not a necessary and sufficient condition. We need a central banker who's willing to prick the bubble. So far, it doesn't look like we have one.
So we've knocked off monetary policy. Let's talk about fiscal policy.
Well, you know, fiscal policy, I don't think, you know, people understand how extreme measures we have taken to keep our economies above water. And had we not taken them, we'd still probably be mired in the last recession. But, you know, if you look at a $1 trillion budget deficit in the United States, and the U.S. deficit, by the way, as a share of GDP is no better than Greece's. If you look at that, history will tell you that these postures are unsustainable. And I think that if you look at what's happening in the so-called PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain, you'll see that those kind of deficits are not a solution to triple-digit oil prices, that they're just going to make things more difficult. And what they're going to do in the very short run is they're going to lead to the collapse of the European Monetary Union. And what we're going to find is, just as people all around the world got affected by the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis, even though they may have no investments at all in the U.S. real estate market, what we're going to find is that when Greece defaults and Spain defaults, and they will because they have no choice, we're all going to find that we're going to be impacted even though we haven't invested a cent in the Greek bond market. And what I find particularly interesting is that 4 or 5 years ago, taxpayers around the world, not in Canada, but certainly in most other places, were told that if they didn't open their wallets and they didn't bail out financial institutions that were supposedly too big to fail, then we would face a disaster, that we would face a financial meltdown worse than the 1929 Depression. You might think, given those circumstances, after taxpayers had written that kind of check, that there would be fundamental reform of the financial system so that taxpayers would not be put in the same position. Just last year, Union Bank of Switzerland, one of the largest and most so-called sophisticated banks of the world, wrote down $2.3 billion. This is the same bank that got bailed out to the tune of $56 billion only 4 years earlier. And only last week, JP Morgan, whose CEO was at the forefront of resisting regulatory reform on Wall Street, his bank wrote down $2 billion. I think we're going to find that when Greece and Spain defaults, we're going to see that the financial market system is no better able to deal with that than it was with the subprime mortgages. The bad news is a Greek default is soon going to be playing at a bank right next to you. The good news is that after taxpayers are once again asked to bail out imprudent banks, we're finally going to get the regulatory reform that we should have 4 or 5 years ago. And key among that regulatory reform is going to be the so-called Volcker rule, which is going to prevent large banks from playing Russian roulette with your savings. And we're going to bring back the old traditional barriers that separated deposit-taking institutions like CIBC from investment banks like CIBC World Markets. These are the kind of changes that you might have thought would have been automatic after the financial disaster of 4 years ago, but these changes are coming.
I hope you're right.
Oh, I am right. Believe me. I am right.
Guys,
and if you want to look at what the new economy is going to be looking like, one thing you're going to see in the new economy is a whole lot less investment bankers and a whole lot less hedge fund managers. I'm not against investment bankers. I mean, I spent 20 years working for an investment bank. But one thing I will point out is that the size of the financial service industry has doubled to around 20% in the last 30 years in countries like Canada and the United States. And that has rode the wave of deregulation the last 30 years that started with Margaret Thatcher and Reagan and was carried on through the Greenspan era. I think we're going to reverse that. I think the financial service industry is going to be downsized, and I think in its place we're going to see industries come back like manufacturing that we thought were gone forever.
The only difficulty I have with that, and is that it seems to me that if one could say that there were even a hope of that, it would have been with the past administration. When the biggest contributor to Barack Obama's campaign is Goldman Sachs, which it is the single biggest contributor, and when you've got a self-selection process of who goes into politics in the first place, I simply don't see where the mechanism is going to be overturned. I was once actually sitting in your chair, Jeff, and I was giving a speech, and I said, when you go and you vote under our current system, it's like a little bit like choosing which pedophile is going to be babysitting your children or grandchildren. Wait, Jeff, please let me finish. Somebody in the audience said, I think you owe somebody right now an apology. I said, you're absolutely right. If there are any pedophiles out here, I meant no offense.
You know, I know that Wall Street looks invincible right now. I know that many people think that the Obama administration is in the pocket of Wall Street. And they're probably true, but I think it's instructive to take a historical perspective and look at the circumstances under which regulations evolved. And I speak specifically of the Glass-Steagall Act in the United States in the early 1930s that separated investment banking from deposit-taking institutions. In the Roaring '20s, Wall Street owned Washington every bit as much as Wall Street owns Washington today. But of course, what happened after the 1929 Depression was an unprecedented string of bank failures. And we found in the backdrop of that all of a sudden Wall Street lost its power. And all of a sudden governments were emboldened and empowered to do things that 4 or 5 years ago would have been unthinkable. Yes, it's true that J.P. Morgan just happens to be the largest, spent the most on political contributions of any bank on Wall Street. But, you know, if American taxpayers who already own institutions like AIG, because when they went bankrupt, there was nobody else left to own them but American taxpayers, when they're called to do this again, I think the pendulum will swing. And history is showing that the pendulum can swing very significantly. That the last 30 years of financial market deregulation has come to an end. And as I say, in the future, we're going to see a chastened and downsized financial service industry.
That would be very interesting to watch that. Anyway,